Thanks, everyone, for joining us, the Project Censored radio show. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff. We're very glad right now to welcome to the program Harsha Walia, who is an author organizer based in Vancouver. And Harsha, I invited you on the show to discuss the convergence, as you put it in your book, Border and Rule, of racist nationalism and border imperialism. And I'll start here with what Truth Out reported in late January that over 15 Navajo Nation members were, quote, swept up in anti-immigration raids, leading officials from the Navajo Nation to warn their members to carry personal identification that indicates that they are citizens of the United States at all times. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I wanted to start with a quote from your book where you write, quote, "The formation of the U.S.-Mexico border and immigration as a race-making regime cannot be analyzed outside the reciprocal processes of empire building and genocidal violence. Framing immigration restrictions as solely anti-migrant racism ignores the ways in which immigration policy is foundational constituted through and intertwined with anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, and imperialist warfare to consolidate the U.S. as a nation-state and empire," end quote. So with that, I was wondering if you could take us on into this analysis a bit more and why it's not, or it shouldn't be surprising to read that an escalation in violence towards migrants is also causing an escalation in violence towards Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, thank you for that. And also, wow, my quotes are so wordy. Um, I think, yeah, exactly as you put it, I don't think it should be surprising for a number of reasons. I mean, I think perhaps the kind of most surface one is that we know that, immigration is not something that is really about people's so-called legal status. It is entirely about racism, right? Like when we think about who is a so-called illegal immigrant, the construction is racialized. I don't think many Americans know, for example, that the largest single nationality of people who overstay their visas in the United States are actually Canadians, right? It's not who people think it is. And so, in the same way that crime has very little to do with actions and behaviors, and it's really a racist, classist kind of construction that is created by media and education and social norms, the same way immigration has very little to do with one's actual legal status. And we'll get to that in a second. And everything to do with race and race making. And so, in that sense, it's not surprising that anyone who appears racialized would get picked up in an immigration raid, irrespective of their so-called legal status, and absolutely including people who are actually indigenous to these lands. Which is also in the settler colonial context, the deep hypocrisy isn't the word because it's foundational. The ways in which immigration is actually a project of empire, right? Because the first settlers on these lands were people who were committed to the genocidal project of what is the United States, or where I live, what is Canada. And so immigration has its foundations in the context of settlement and colonization. And so there's something deeply offensive about even, claiming the United States as a white supremacist project, because that absolutely ignores the reality of genocide, which is ongoing on these lands, and the ways in which the border has captured Indigenous nations and subjected them not only to settler colonial genocide, but also to the violences of immigration. Border towns and Indigenous communities in border towns are some of the most militarized communities in the United States, for example.
Yeah, and I also wanted to unpack there because there's the, you know, Navajo Nation saying, carry the papers that show that you're citizens of the United States. And this is also something that you unpack in your book, this tiered reality of citizenship, right? The idea that Navajo or Diné should always be carrying papers to prove their citizenship in a nation that is continuously trying to eradicate them. And you write, and this is a shorter quote. I'm not going to read just quotes from your book, I promise, although it's very quotable. Quote, "State citizenship is less about collective participation in governance of life and more about an authoritarian system of governance over life." And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this kind of thinking and how this idealized idea of citizenship and the liberties that that supposedly brings with it is a fallacy.
Yeah, I think here history is instructive. Like a lot of people take citizenship kind of for granted, in the sense of like, you're born as a citizen of whatever nation state. Um, but I think what's instructive is like recognizing that the whole concept of citizenship is historically, foundationally, completely tied to empire, where different empires could claim that they had subjects of their empire. And really, the mechanisms and methods of citizenship, like passports and birth certificates, were entirely about population control, being able to surveil populations, making sure that people were not exiting or entering the empire without authorization, the particular ways in which Black people were controlled, like so much identification that we take for granted under the so-called citizenship regime was completely bound up in enslavement. And the control of Black people, Black people's movement, Black people's bodies, Black people's labor. And so all of the ways in which we think of citizenship is really about population control. It's also deeply tied into eugenics. Um, and so, I think it's so important to think outside of these kind of constructed identities of what it means to be, say, American or Canadian, rather than, what are the values that we want when we're thinking about governance, right? Because there is no actual shared value to a nation state other than unbridled loyalty to that nation state. And what that nation state often means by definition is, unquestioned loyalty to its military and its institutions, rather than to people. And I think in that sense, citizenship is also, it's so harmful because, again, the fact that someone could be our neighbor and be undocumented means that we don't think of them as belonging in our community just by virtue of their citizenship status, right? Even though we probably have much more in common with them and have kinship ties with them in our local community, rather than, a white settler that's halfway across the country. And so the ways in which it distorts our kinship networks, and really breaks solidarity, with our neighbors is, something to really think about when we're deconstructing citizenship and, really just thinking about pledging allegiance to each other rather than to the nation state.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me a little bit of a conversation that I had with Mohammed Bamia, who's a Palestinian author and professor, who talked about how shallow the idea of citizenship and indeed nationalism is, because it suggests that, oh, this is the one identity that you should really hold on to, as opposed to the like myriad identities that
Mm.
we all have and that we could share and see as a space to build solidarity. But no, we're just supposed to hold on to this imposed identity of nationhood and citizenship, when in reality it takes a lot more than it gives, particularly if you're
Mm.
non-white. Um, and with that, I kind of wanted to zoom out a little bit here and note the interconnected global webs of border violence, because you don't just focus on the United States, although we're a prime example. And one of the examples that you talk about is actually my other home country of Sweden, and thank you for that, because Sweden is oftentimes let off the hook far too easily, pedestaled wrongly by those who see it as a guiding light of so-called democratic socialism. And you talk about the Nordic nationalism that, since the founding of Sweden as a nation state, necessarily violently othered the indigenous of the far north, the Sami, and how this Nordic nationalism is actually a red thread throughout that history that carries us to today in the punitive policies we see against migrants, not just in Sweden, but across Europe. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that creation of nation states, even if it's like 900 years ago, can lay that historic precedent for today's anti-migrant violence.
Yeah, I was hoping that, by looking at different contexts, what would become more apparent to people is that nationalism as a project is deeply bound up in empire and settler colonialism, but also on its own, particularly when it's imbued with the power of the nation states, is incredibly dangerous because at its core, bordering is about othering other people, right? At its very essence is about saying some people belong and some people don't. And that is, of course, deeply exacerbated when we're thinking about the ways in which nationalism is embedded in empire and states like the United States. But really, like you said, it's a through line in different geographies. And, some of the most violent forms of bordering are actually happening in what we know as the global South, right? Like Mexico, for example, deports more Central Americans than the US does now. Of course, that is at the behest of US empire. But at the same time, that is the project of othering. And also nation states like Sweden, I live in Canada, which is seen as like, similar to the Nordic countries, seen as a bastion of social democracy. And I think in social democratic states, there's a really particularly punitive way in which this othering happens. And that is because there's a deep pride in social institutions and national institutions that migrants are excluded from them. And in an era of neoliberal austerity, that is exacerbated, right? Because as we see the social welfare net, to what degree that it existed, whatever limited way it existed, as that's increasingly chipped away by neoliberalism, it's very easy for liberal elites to point the finger at migrants being somehow responsible for, childcare, housing, public education falling apart rather than neoliberal austerity. So in social democratic countries and kind of welfare states, the kind of ways in which bordering policies really impacts migrants is a big part, again, of nation building, right? And finding a very kind of convenient scapegoat for capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's then continued through. I mean, there's the continued colonization and violence against the Sami, and for instance,
Mhm.
in Sweden, through greenwashing campaigns where it's like, hey, we're gonna, cut down a bunch of forest and put wind turbines there, as if that's. And then they get mad that the Sami aren't thankful for that. So those webs are continue to be interconnected. And I want to also talk about, you mentioned neoliberalism and liberal ideology. What we see a lot happening right now is the liberals and their knee-jerk reaction of, we need a so-called return to respectability politics. And oh my gosh, don't we all just miss Obama when he rightfully earned the nickname Deporter in Chief? And I was wondering if you could talk about what those kind of comments say to you about the analysis of what the US nation state really is and what it's designed to do.
Yeah, I think, in that sense, the project of empire building and nation state building at its core is a violent project. It's about extraction, as you pointed out, right? So many kind of national industrial projects are about extraction. I live in Canada, where right now, under the kind of threat of Trump's tariffs, there's a strand of like, pledge allegiance to Canada. And for liberals, that basically means more energy independent projects, which means more extraction on Indigenous lands. um and that we need to be self-sufficient, and that self-sufficiency is not actually about collectivity or solidarity, it's actually about more extraction. Um and so in that sense, similar with migration policy, there's not a huge divergence when it comes to, in the US context, for example, Republican or Democrats, but really in a global sense, we can say extreme far right and centrist kind of politics, because ultimately, um, even though they may be different in how they speak about immigration, for example, at their core, they uphold a number of things. One is at their core, they maintain capitalism and climate catastrophe and colonization. So the root causes of why people are being displaced are never addressed. And so migration is always seen as a crisis. It may be depicted differently, but at its core, migration is always a crisis rather than the root causes of displacement, or the violences of the border. The second is that migrants, when they are talked about in any kind of so-called positive way, it's always in the model of, as you pointed out, respectability, model minority politics, or particularly to extract migrant labor. So we know that, for example, right now, in opposition to Trump, there's this huge rush to say, oh, but we need immigrants, so let's have more temporary visas, right? So we don't want to close the border to immigrants, but not because we're coming from a perspective of solidarity, but because we actually need cheapened labor. And so that continues to feed the capitalist colonial machinery. And the last thing that I would say is that, while Trump, for example, really relies on the kind of culture wars, the deep racism, the kind of spectacle of like fortify the border, what politicians across kind of political stripes really believe in is outsourcing the border. So increasingly, we see border violence not just at the site of the border, while people like Trump really do want to rely on the project of the border itself because it is such a nation building exercise, but really across political stripes, across geographies, the ways in which the border is increasingly being outsourced to the so-called periphery in the global south. We see this in Europe with the immense amounts of violence, for example, in Libya, or the Rwanda deportation flights. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the outsourcing of the border in the US context to Mexico. All of this is really part of how the violence of borders is being globalized literally all around the world. There's no country on the map that is not receiving money from an imperial core country to fortify its borders. And that is something that is a shared vision when it's coming to what the elites called, what they call global migration management. And so those are things that I think are so important to pay attention to because they often fly under the radar. And, Obama was not only deporter in chief, he was really the person who laid the foundation, along with Clinton, for this kind of border outsourcing project and vision that is global in scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very tempting for people to want to say that things were so much better under Obama or, like you said, Clinton. But that is such a shallow way of looking at things and ultimately an incorrect one. And I wanna look also at the class issue here, and also because I have a history and a background in labor organizing, so this is something that's very close to my heart as well. Because, I mean, you mentioned well, we need migrants because we want to extract their labor. I mean, it's not like there's no solidarity there from the state, but where there could be and where there has been historically and still is in pockets is that, the migrants, the working class here in the United States, um, predominantly BIPOC, but also poor white folks, building solidarity across the class structure as opposed to paying attention to the borders of race and culture and things like that. And here again, I'd like to throw in a quote from your book where you write, quote, "Far right revanchism is inseparable from the making of class identity through race, the scapegoating of foreigners, solidifying anti-migrant xenophobia, and the reproduction of settler entitlement," end quote. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this class analysis and and the antidote to that far right revanchism that you write about.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that question because I think, a lot of times we, of course, focus on the race making of borders, but it is so crucial to capitalism. Like it's not secondary. So I'll offer a few things. One is that we know that capitalism and bosses require cheapened labor, right? They're always looking for cheapened labor. And here I'm very clear it's cheapened, it's not cheap. No such thing as cheap labor. Um, and one of the key ways that that can happen for the bosses is by having a segment of the workforce that is deportable, right? Like when you are deportable, and that's a crucial thing to understand, there's a difference between the deportation machinery and deportability. Because economies like the United States would absolutely collapse if everyone who was undocumented was actually deported, right? So it's not about actually deporting everyone. It's about creating a condition of inherent precarity by saying you are always deportable. And in the United States, for example, every time there's a union drive and there are, undocumented or precarious migrants involved, one of the first threats is ICE or DHS, right? And so that is not a coincidence that one of the key union busting tactics is to actually threaten immigration on workers. And so, the border acts as a spatial fix for capital accumulation. It is like, from my perspective, it's basically the flip side of outsourcing. The kinds of jobs that can't be outsourced to the global south are insourced through cheapened migrant labor, right? And so that is exactly what border creates. It creates a spatial fix for capitalism. And then added on to that is this question of solidarity, right? Because one of the ways in which the far right breaks solidarity is to say, oh, migrant workers are stealing your jobs, right? Unemployment is because of migrant workers, which is ridiculous. Like you can't literally go into a workplace and like jack a job. Like that's not how it works, right? Um, But the ideology is so powerful because then not only are migrants being extracted from, but then also there's a tactic to break solidarity across the working class. Where again, you know, your coworker, you no longer see them as your coworker in struggle on the shop floor. You see them as someone who is somehow stealing your job or lowering the wage floor. And so I think the antidote to that is, you know, really the understanding that the working class is global, that when we think of the working class in bordered ways, whether across race or citizenship, then we are not understanding solidarity, but also we are actually inaccurately understanding the function of the border, right? So when some unions say, you know, we need to protect American jobs for American workers, it is a misread of the border's function. The border cannot function to protect American workers. The whole point of the border is to provide a constant supply of cheapened labor, whether outsourced or insourced. And so it is to really have an internationalist understanding of the class struggle, and to recognize that borders work to cheapen labor across geographies. And so that is what is required, right? We have to understand that our enemy arrives in a limousine and not on a boat, or doesn't arrive in a caravan, right? And that's the kind of analysis that labor struggles need to continuously put forward rather than a nationalist protectionist ideology.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think that also speaks to the importance of combining movements. I'm a big proponent of not looking at issues in silos. And so the labor movement has to also necessarily be anti-war,
Yeah.
because if you want people to be safe in their home places, then you have to look at the cause of a major cause of people leaving their home places is US imperialism. And so these two things have to be combined if we're ever going to
Mhm.
actually get anywhere. So um, yeah, I mean, Harsha, there's so much to dig into your book. I definitely recommend that folks check it out. It's been out for a few years. Border and Rule. You can check it out wherever you buy books, but not Amazon. So, Harsha, anything else that you'd like to add, or where folks can find more of your work?
No, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on and contextualizing this for us. Appreciate it.